speaker this afternoon is Don Perkins. He's written a book called The Barns of Maine. He's a carpenter builder who's now turned into a freelance writer. Published this book. He has them available for sale, signed copies afterwards. And without any further ado, I will introduce Don to give us our program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Rodney, and the folks at the Historical Society for having me. This is something that I'm having great fun with. It started as a newspaper column in 2007 and 8 for a great New Gloucester newspaper. And in 2012, I finally got a book deal with it, and went all over the state, from Arundel to Aroostook, I like to say. And I call myself a barnologist, because barns are a study just like anything else. It's been a fascinating study. How many people here have a barn? Anybody? Okay. A few. Well, if I've done my work today, you'll be barnologists as well. So. I start the slide today with the show with this slide, and you see it says 1880 right here. This barn is in Milo, and it's just a great example of the zenith or the heyday of the Victorian barn in Maine, which was this time. And this is all slate here. The cupola is slate. This hood over the door is slate. They have a lot of slate quarries in Milo and Brownville. And this is just a great example of I call these barns the old majestics, these kind of these big dairy barns from back then. I mean, this window is maybe something you more associate with a church than a barn. It's just a great example of the zenith of barn building. As we go, please raise your hand for a question. I will have a question period at the end, but if I find oftentimes the best way to deal with a question is often right in the moment. So please raise your hand if something comes up and we'll address it. This barn is older than the 1881 we just saw. This one is 1830s, and you can tell a lot about a barn just from the outside. You'll notice there's no real fancy trimmings on this one. The door is actually offset a little bit here to the left. The windows are symmetrical with the roof peak, but the door is offset. And that is a barn from before the Civil War. The Victorians, and maybe this era, they liked everything very balanced and centered, but older barns, this one is 1830s, and it's in Bridgeton. And you notice the door is offset, and that was for a reason. You kept the cows or the livestock on the shorter side, and that's the side that got the sun, the south side. And this wide side would be the north side, and that was where the haymow was. And this is a time when you didn't really have a hayloft. You had a haymow and a side for livestock. They call this barn the Temperance Barn because it was built without any rum during its raising. Apparently that was the beverage on hand at every barn raising in the early 1800s. But these teetotaling New Englanders didn't want that, so it's been called the Temperance Barn. And I want to read just a passage from my book about this barn. There was a boy who grew up here. He went off to the Civil War to fight, and he was taken prisoner in the war. But he returned back home to Bridgeton afterwards, and he left a diary of his boyhood, and he talked about the barn. Although we lived in cold and sterile Maine, we did not lack for many luxuries of life. Edwin described how the attic provided a place for children to play, as they were not allowed to play inside the main house in those days. Quote, "The attic was one vast room where we youngsters were monarchs of all we surveyed. When the weather would not permit us to stay outdoors, we had great times here. The barn was another place free from the constraints of instilled order found within the proper rooms of the family home. If a young boy were to kiss a girl, he had a much better chance of doing so in the barn, especially when the corn was ready." He's talking about a corn husking thing here now. After corn harvesting came husking. It was the custom in those days to fill the barn floor with unhusked corn and then ask all the young people to come and husk it. We all enjoyed these occasions, a regular lark. Many of our neighbors made a gala event of it, asking all the girls to become and get the husking out of the way early so dancing could begin. There was a rule that whoever found a red ear was entitled to a kiss. There was some rivalry among the boys when they selected partners, and some of the girls would hide their red ears if their partner was not to their liking. This barn is in Searsport on Route 1 up the coast. And this lady grew up in Gorham and was a great interview. She runs an antique thing out of this barn. And her name is Liz, and I just wanted to read a little excerpt about her from the book. Liz Dominic loves barns. Liz grew up in Gorham on a 600-acre hay farm with a big barn. In the summer, the family would stay at a cottage outside of Bangor in Herman. There were farm families all around in those parts, and Liz recalled playing with friends in one of the area's big barns. Farms and barns just became part of life, she said. I think that's why I feel the way I do about them. To me, a barn is the closest thing we have to European cathedrals, but they're made out of wood. Now in her 80s, she recalled visiting her father's farm and barn in Gorham, which is still standing. Her father purchased the property, the main crop of which was hay, because of its proximity to Portland. Quote, everything was horse-drawn, she said. There were big stables. There were no automobiles. However, in the 1920s, only a few years after her father first purchased the property, automobiles started taking over. Quote, the gasoline engine became very popular, said Liz. His customers switched. When Liz was only about 3 years old, her father was forced to sell and took a job with the phone company. The family then moved to Massachusetts. Liz said the family visited Maine every summer. Like many of us, memories from childhood can easily be triggered decades later by a particular sight, sound, or smell. For Liz, it was revisiting her father's old Gorham hay barn. Today, only 2 of the original 600 acres remain with the barn. The rest was developed into housing. Quote, it's kind of sad for me, she said. He had a pond and used to sell ice for the winter. He did everything. The last time Liz visited, she hadn't planned on going into the barn. She simply stopped her car, got out front, and looked. This young woman came out and asked me if she could help. I said, I don't want to bother you, but these used to be my father's barn. It's a nostalgic thing for me. The owner then asked me if I'd like to come into the barn. When I walked into the barn, the smell of hay and animals must have hit some memory nerve because my eyes watered up. I almost cried in front of her. I was very surprised and a little embarrassed that that feeling came over me. I didn't actually remember the barn, but my body remembered it. Isn't that strange? And she wrote a poem, the only poem I have in the book, about barn life. It's called Sanctuary. I push my way into the vaulted coolness of the barn. Summer sun is left outside to scorch and burn. My ears will know those things I cannot see. The rhythmic crunch of horses' noontime fare. The rustle of a mouse upon the hayloft stair. I hear the mighty bull snort air, so restless to be free. My heart is tethered just as he. My eyes can see in dim light now. I watch the swallows swoop and swoon on high. Busy families. Here comes old Rex to rest beside me. He nuzzles in to lie beside the door and cocks an ear to hear alarm, but all is calm and still at noontime on the farm. In this cathedral kind of space is such a quiet place. All right. Well, let's get into the study here. You can learn a lot about things just by researching of the word. And barn is an old English word. And it basically means, it's a combination of the old words for barley and house. It's a barley house, or where you store grain. And it's why barn and barley share a common spelling. Now what I take from this is, this has nothing to do with livestock. This is from the old grain storage days. Okay, well, construction is what drew me to barns in the beginning. And they're built with bents, this one lying down and these two standing here. And they can be built in various ways. They're held together with mortise and tenons, we've probably heard that. I was surprised to hear how old this technology is. It's much older than Maine or America or anything like that. This is the tenon, and it sticks into the mortise. The pyramids, 5,000 years ago, okay, they've done excavations at that site, and they found wooden sleds where they hauled the stones. And the sleds were made with this mortise and tenon technology. So it's at least 5,000 years old. As I studied, I found that there are really three types of traditional wooden barn in Maine. The first is the English. And what makes a barn an English barn is it has its doors under the eave wall instead of the gable end here. And this was done for the hand threshing of grain. You'll see there's no basement, it's very simple building. The door's here, and there would be another set on the back side because the farmer wanted the wind to blow through the shortest dimension of the building for the hand threshing of grain. He'd bring his grain in and start to thresh it with a flail, which is two sticks joined by a cord, and he would start to beat this and get the husk off and this kind of thing. And he'd sweep it up and open the barn doors and toss it to the wind, separate the wheat from the chaff. That's where we get that saying. The chaff would blow out, and what held the wheat and everything from blowing out of the barn, the thresh, was a board where we get that term threshold, holding the thresh. Okay. But we found that didn't work so good over here when we became much more focused on livestock. And we put the door on the end instead of on the side. And with a corresponding door on the back, most farms kind of progressed through the generations, and they got more livestock, got bigger operations, and they wanted a bigger barn. This barn was very easy to expand, this design, because you could just add onto the back of it. And it was very efficient because this hall went right through the center, and the farmer could service all sides just by driving down that long length. If you tried to expand a barn like this, you could go out to the sides with it, but you got further and further away from that central aisle. And if you expanded into the rear, you had that roof line that got in the way. So this just became the much more efficient style. And then the last generation is the gambrel, and this was when commercial farming really became the thing. It was no longer maybe a small family subsistence farm where they did a little bit of everything. Now they were concentrated on one crop, usually dairy, here in Maine. And this design gave a nice big hayloft for the hay fork. You've probably seen those, or maybe even used those at your family's farms or whatever. But this design allowed a big fork full of hay to be picked up and rolled down the track, which would be parallel with the roof ridge, and then dumped off into one side or the other. Yes?
On that other farm that you showed, not that one, the other one?
This one?
Previous one. What's the bottom part for? And
This is, I should have mentioned, this is the Shaker Village in New Gloucester. They keep sheep down here, but this was called the stable. And they have another barn in the rear that was called the ox barn. But they used to keep the horses up here. And today they keep sheep down here. Well, okay, so barns evolved just like anything, and it was basically these factors. Grain to livestock, our climate, where we found we had to keep our animals inside a lot more than they did in England. We talked about expansion. Hay and manure handling were always changing. And then we'll talk later, in the early 20th century, disease actually became a factor in how people made their barns. Well, you can't talk about barns without talking about farming. And I became fascinated with the history of farming. People have struggled here ever since they got here. This is not the breadbasket of America. It's a short growing season. Rocks all over the place when they got here. But they did it. But you know, original settlers did not come here to farm typically, but to lumber and fish, and that's why most of our settlements are along rivers and the coast, etc. Livestock fed on browse and often had no barn to seek protection. Early barns were very crude. You normally don't find barns before this period around here because of the French and Indian War, when most things were burned. There's Portland and Falmouth were pretty well defended, and maybe even Scarborough. But you start getting like in Gloucester or even just a little ways outside of Portland, most things were burned. And old barns were pretty low because oxen did most of the labor. And this was mirrored in the woods. You think of Paul Bunyan had bathed the blue ox, right? Did not have a horse. Horses came a little bit later and made the barns taller. Okay. Well, as I looked around with my barnologist eye, and I noticed these three, the English, the New England, and the Gambrel, I noticed different parts of the state have more type than another. Anybody from Washington County? I almost never get a hand on that one. Well, as I traveled for the book, I was like, boy, there's all these small English barns up here in Washington County. What is the story with that? Well, I deduced it into these couple of factors. Very strong English lineage, and they are isolated people. And you can see this with kind of the Maine accent, right? You may know the Maine accent comes from England. Most people came to Maine from Massachusetts, and the Boston accent and the Maine accent is kind of similar. And when you think of an area that still has a strong Maine accent, they still have that early dialect, it's Washington County. And so I think the same thing happened with the barns. They went with their old world tradition and they stayed with it much longer than other areas of the state. And these are the characteristics of barns there in that part. They're small subsistence farms, a lot of hand-hewn frames, and that speaks to the economy and isolation of the area and the maybe a lot of the poor farmers there. Very plain, cedar shingles almost exclusively. I think there's a lot of cedar up in that neck of the woods. And a lot of houses along the coast will be made with cedar siding because it's just very durable. Whereas here, it's mostly clapboards when you see a barn. Manure basements became a thing. We'll talk about that. But you don't see that usually on an English barn. You don't see cupolas or any real fancy Victorian stuff. They are separate from the house typically. They're built of H-bents, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. But the larger barns show their old English roots and are made with English tying joints. Anybody heard that term before, English tying joint? Okay, one person. In construction? Yeah. This is an area that fascinated me, this English tying joint. And this is it here. This is an 1830s barn, that Temperance barn in Bridgeton. And this is what we're referring to as a tying joint. Everything is tied together at this point. The post, the plate, the rafter, the tie beam, they all come together here, and it is tied together in a very effective manner. And it's old, it's medieval, it's right from the 13th century. And it was brought over here pretty much unaltered. And it remained the standard right up to the 1800s. And that's 500 years, maybe 600 years. It's hard to think of something that would last for 500 or 600 years being unaltered. And the carpenters were ingenious. This is a flared post. It's wider here at the top, and it's more square at the bottom. And the carpenter took advantage of the natural taper of a tree. And this is an upside down tree. They took advantage of that flare. Any questions?
Do they sometimes refer to as gun stock?
Yes, yep, exactly. And you'll see that in houses. But there's a lot going on here. There's a tenon up into this, and that's pegged from outside. There's a tenon going up into this, and you can see the peg here. And you see these Roman numerals. Everything is way, this is much before interchangeable parts. This is where everything had to be fit to everything. It was the old scribe rule way. Okay, and we just talked about that.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
are people still building barns like this?
Yeah, but it's more for like fancy, harkening back to something,
It's not called post and beam.
Post and beam is more like when you're using heavy timbers joined with metal hardware. That's the technical definition of post and beam. Timber framing is what this is referred to, when everything is pegged. Okay. So this is that earlier 1830s barn and the time joint right from that. So again, from the medieval time right to the 1800s, it was brought right over here. And as a barnologist or somebody who studies this, you can look and say, oh, these were English people. These weren't French, these weren't German. You can just see it in the construction. So we talked about H-bents earlier with English barns. Well, that's this center thing here. You see here the wall plate is on the top of the post. Here it's dropped. No, here it's at the top, I'm sorry. And here it's dropped. This is kind of like the earliest form, and then if the other side of the barn would be here, and it would make kind of the letter H. That's where they get that. So you see a lot of that in Washington County. You see a lot of this where they dropped, instead of a long one-piece thing, they dropped this in this segmented, much more modular construction. And you can think, if you want to build a 100-foot long barn, you can't, it would be pretty hard to find some 100-foot long trees that you could get an 8x8 out of. So they would segment it like this. And this here is the hand hewing. You can't saw that. Well, you can, but it takes a lot of work and setup. This is much harder to saw, whereas this is a square post and something you get right from the sawmill. All right, a little more about Maine farming. This is 1800 to the start of the Civil War. Beef and sheep were the principal thing in the early days. At statehood, we had about 31,000 barns. 1825, the Erie Canal opens. You're probably thinking, well, what does that have to do with barns? Well, it had a lot to do with farming because it started putting pressure on the Maine farmer. This is not the breadbasket of America. The Erie Canal opened up some of the West, so to speak, back then. And they had a longer growing season, better soil, and they could ship stuff here cheaper than we could grow it. And so we had to come up with something else. And that's when dairy really became a thing. Because we had a lot of cleared land, and it was a perishable product that couldn't be shipped as easily as grain. So dairy, and that became the New England story for Maine, for Vermont. We just couldn't compete with grain. Interestingly enough, 1850, an apple orchard would be your best source of income here. And at 1860, we'd almost doubled the barns we'd had at statehood. So we were very much growing when this time. This is post-Civil War. Beef largely disappears in favor of dairy because that became our strategy of farming. The Maine Dairymen's Association began 1874. 1880, that was the slide I first showed, that was the high point of farming in Maine, which kind of surprised me. I thought it might have been a little bit later, like maybe before the Depression. But no, and if you know history, you know after the Civil War, a lot of people moved out of Maine because they saw greener pastures, less winter, longer growing seasons, etc. We did start shipping milk, and Maine became part of what they called the Boston Milk Shed. We'd ship it by rail. In the 1880s, now dairy is our leading farm industry, and it stayed that way right to the present. All right, well, anybody here from Aroostook? All right, we got a hand, good. Well, I married a county girl from Caribou. Where are you from?
Caribou.
Caribou, interesting. Well, you probably recognize these big gambrel barns. As I went around the state looking again, I'm like, what is the deal with these large gambrel barns? This seems to be the exclusive Aroostook County barn. And this is why. There wasn't people up there way early on. They were very isolated. It took a border dispute with Canada for us to put a road up through there. And they're all commercial scale, 20th century. This is a barn built for horses and hay. It's not a barn built more for dairy. Here's some characteristics of the Aroostook barns. They're big barns. Most are post 1900, large scale. You find, interestingly enough, there's no Maine accent up there. The Maine accent I found kind of stops at Millinocket. And then you get the French Canadian, right? That's Aroostook. So naturally you would not find this in Aroostook. You find a hybrid of frames, of studs and heavy timbers, and that kind of reflects this period because carpentry was changing from the bigger posts and beams to more of stud framing. They don't like the barns attached to the house. They have few manure basements and built for horses and hay, but that soon transformed after World War II because everybody started getting tractors. Now, do we need to talk about the manure basement? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. When the first folks came and started farming with their small English barns, they would pitch the manure outdoors and put it in a big heap. And there it would sit and degrade and erode. And there was very little understanding about fertilizer. And you read old farming texts and they'll talk about how their fields were starting to suffer after several seasons. And they were putting anything and everything on them to try to enrich them. They would put leaves from the woods, they would put feathers and even human hair, anything to try to, and then people realized, hey, you know what, this manure we've been throwing out here is a wonderful resource to enrich these fields, and we need to start taking better care of it. So it was about the 1830s or so, they started building their barns on slopes, or digging out sides of them and putting a scuttle so you could dump the manure back, and there it stayed protected, and they could go out and scatter it in the spring. But you don't see it up in Aroostook just because of the time period of these barns, and we'll get to that when we start talking about disease. Any questions on that? All right, well, here's a big barn in Aroostook. This one's in Van Buren, just north of Caribou. And it must have been something in its day when it was all painted white. But it still has the original wood shingle roof, which is amazing. You don't see that down here. And it has this ladder. And I was puzzled by this. And I like to pose this to the crowd. Does anybody know what that's all about? Some people would say maybe snow, but I found that the snow does not hang around. Those are usually very big cleared fields of these farms in Aroostook. We don't have fields down here at all compared to what they have. They have an enormous field. And the wind blows the snow, so it's not good snow.
Lightning rods?
Ah, Somebody said it, yes.
Check the ball.
Somebody said lightning rods, exactly. Lightning rod maintenance. But as I gave this talk in one town, a guy said, well, they're not there anymore, but that was for fire. And I said, really? Tell me about that. He said, well, they're not there anymore, but there would have been platforms up here, maybe 3 of them or 4 of them of the length of the roof, and they would have held a rain barrel up there. And they would have let that fill with rainwater, and if the farmer's worst fear of his life, you know, he's the lightning strike and he looks out and sees his barn roof is on fire, he could run up there and soak the roof. And I think, I had never heard that before, and I had never seen remnants of these platforms on any barns, but maybe. But I think, yeah, I think the lightning rod maintenance is much more of a reason. Anyway, don't typically see that down around this area, but I do see it up in Aroostook, which is interesting.
Although that one does not have a lightning rod.
No, right.
True, true. It's no longer an active farm, it hasn't been for a while, I don't know, maybe they cashed in on the copper of it or something. Well, this is the inside of that barn, and it's got that dropped H-bent kind of configuration. You'll see the boards are horizontal, whereas in the early days, barns are vertical. And that's to shed rainwater naturally. But this barn is 1930s. By that time, you were siding your building, and you would put your boards horizontal. You see these rafters are just peeled poles. Everything in this barn was hand hewn, which for 1930s is amazing. Because in southern Maine, you would never see that. They would all been sawmill timber by the 1930s. It just speaks to the economy of things, and maybe there wasn't sawmills as handily as there were down here. Here's another Aroostook barn. This one is right about 1900. And it has an English kind of layout, which is odd, but it's a very plain building. And here's the inside of it. Again, these peeled pole kind of rafters, and everything being hewn very roughly. And you can see the shape of the roof with the steeper pitch and then the shallower pitch. They put this purlin beam right here to make that transition up there. And you can see right up into the old wood shingles here between the cracks. Okay, well, we talked about Washington County, Aroostook County. Let's talk about the rest of Maine, as I call it. This is maybe the barn we're more familiar with, we're seeing. We like them attached to the house. We built them on slopes with the gable entry. Why do we do this? Well, I argue we had a wide range of time and transformation, and our outside influences were much more readily adopted. There were farm journals during the day, back in the day, and you can read about them talking about manure basements, talking about this farmer who has tried out this new system on his barn, and et cetera, et cetera. This is Shaker Village in New Gloucester, the stable and the ox barn.
I came here with the intent of asking you about the twin barns of Aroostook County.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
And this is the closest thing I've come to a twin barn yet,
yes.
and that's not in Aroostook County.
You're right, that twin barn thing is interesting.
I trust you've gone by Aroostook County.
Well, it's not part of my talk, and I'm impressed that you brought it up, because most people don't know about that.
There you go.
Yeah.
They
I
haven't-
can't speak to those very much.
They haven't traveled Route 11 from Fort Kent down. That's for sure.
Yeah, they're called the Madawaska Twin Barn, named after the town.
And I was there in the late 70s, early 80s for about 6 years, and we traveled different territories in the summertime.
Uh-huh.
And it was interesting to see the two twin barns. One of them meticulously maintained, the other one falling down.
Yeah.
And I'll bet there's a half a dozen along that road from there down to Pat.
Mhm. I've seen a few up there.
You are not unfamiliar with that.
I've seen them in the around Fort Kent area.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah, and my father-in-law drives a taxi cab up there, and he'll tell me when he sees them. They're usually kind of off the beaten path. There's a couple of them right on Route 1, I think, but,
Well,
and you're talking Route 11 as well.
that's the terminus of Route 1, if you want to call it, or the beginning, whichever.
Right. And probably, you know, one barn is falling down, and they're keeping one good one up because
That's what it appears like.
they could only afford to probably
And they don't
keep
need
one.
as much now, probably.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, that's interesting. Well, here's the characteristics of these barns that we know, right, in our neck of the woods. They're the New England or Yankee barn. Wide range of sizes, almost all geared towards dairy. Gable entry, and we like them attached to the house, right? They have manure basements. Some very gentlemanly farmers would highly embellish their buildings. We see all kinds of different bent styles, but the hand hewing really stopped about the Civil War. It's just because of the sawmills and people had better access to things, etc. Well, here's the inside of a barn from the early days of barn building. And you'll see there was no siding, right? It was probably cold and drafty for the animals, right? This may be the early 1800s. Well, you only need to go about 50 years, and all of a sudden we have some of these beautiful forms gracing the land. This barn's in New Gloucester, and it's called a high drive bank barn. This was called the high drive. They were just taking advantage of gravity to help do their chores. The hay would be brought in up above, the animals would be stabled down below. So you just brought the hay up, tossed it down to the animals processed it, and then this slope continues, and there'd be a manure basement down there. So it was just kind of a circular pattern, everything worked very nicely. We have cupolas here, because we realized we should start venting barns. It's just a great example of how things were getting refined and we started learning about how to keep animals. And this is a good quote from 1907, Maine's Dairymen's Association's meeting, and I'll just read it. I am here this day to say a word of welcome to you who represent the happy homes of Maine. You also representative of the great dairy interests of the state. Dairying is today simply in its infancy. I remember when a boy, and some of you older ones can easily remember the old barn with its great cracks, the scrub cow, the old milking stool. But a wonderful change has come as the years have passed by. Today we find the blooded cow. Today we find a better barn, a better house. We find the barn shingled and clapboarded and painted, and a neatly kept lawn around the buildings. Everything has been progressing and advancing with great strides since you and I were boys, and I believe the future will see as great an advance in this industry. So we understand the blooded cow, you know what they're referring to there? They're actually, it's not just the family cow where you've got the milk, whatever she produced is what you got. Now they're breeding for production. It's the commercial kind of start of farming.
What's the scrub cow?
Well, that's the opposite of the blooded cow. The scrub cow, you know, well, that's just the family cow. I don't know where father got it, but we hope it produces, you know. But then the commercial interests in there started. The Holsteins won that. And, you know, you think of Smiling Hill Farm, those are Holsteins. Those are the big producers. Well, I mentioned that we would talk about disease and how that shapes up. And this hit the state in a big way in 1885, when every cow at the University of Maine was found infected and slaughtered. They didn't know what else to do. At the turn of the last century, there weren't too many inspectors, and the Portland Board of Health required shipping any milk coming into the city needed to be tested, and this is where you started getting pasteurization, et cetera, because of this TB. But by the 30s, we got a handle on the TB. And I would read in my research about, people would get together for their county fairs, the Freiburg Fair, the Cumberland Fair, et cetera. And there maybe be one farmer whose cows were sick, and it spread to the other farmers. They took it all home, and there was big uproar, and everybody pointed to Johnson, and they said his livestock should be killed and his barn burned. So we lost some barns because of that. And this was all from this manure basement. Phenomenal. In 1900 to the 40s, cow manure was found to be a host for TB. So the manure basements were phased out. And if you notice dairy operations today, they have their manure in a big pit, a concrete enclosure, way away from the barn. They started wanting farmers to get rid of their wood floors and put in cement so they could be hosed down and cleaned. Wood was just a sponge for bacteria. Lighting came in, the whitewashing with lime, and that was not white paint, that was lime coating, which was a natural antiseptic. And it would just tell a farmer, like, oh, well, there's mildew all over that wall, I couldn't see that before, et cetera, et cetera. And the cupolas started going away in favor of the metal roof ventilators to combat manure dust. Because before they were milking the cows and the manure was nearby, and the dust would get into the milk. And now today, in some older barns, you have to have what's called a dust-tight ceiling. You often see tongue and groove boards over where they do the milking. And that was to stop the hay dust or anything else coming down in. Well, here's a barn in Bethel of a family that kind of went through this transformation. This is the old barn from the middle 1800s, and it's on a slope. It has a manure basement. This was put in the 1960s, and you'll see almost nothing of a traditional barn carries over. There's no big hayloft. It's right on the ground with a concrete floor. They said they moved the cows here and kept the hay in here. So disease started changing the way our barns looked. And I was up there and I asked this guy, I said, how come your barn's 3 different shades of red? And he said, every year, Father would go down and buy 5 gallons of barn red. And they kept changing the formula. Well, I'm almost wrapped up. There's some historic barn quotes here, which are fascinating to read from farm journals. The Maine farmer, 1857, overlooked the building on the farm, which requires the most study and real good judgment to plan and to construct, is the one least thought of in this respect, and that is the barn. They kind of just put as many cows as they could once dairy took off. They stuffed these things with cows, and they started having problems. 1868, stud framing is becoming a thing. Necessity has done much for the building public by introducing to their favorable notice the balloon-style 2-by stud of building wooden buildings, a style which is not well understood in the old, settled, and well-timbered portions of our country, like Maine. You may have heard this balloon. Anybody know the origins of why it's called balloon framing, which was stud framing? The stud went from the top of the foundation all the way up, maybe 2 or 3 stories to the eaves of the roof. And it was horrible for fire because it was just a chimney for them if you didn't put blocking in. Well, it was named balloon framing. They say this has its origins in the 1830s in Chicago, where they didn't have a lot of big forests like we do, so they had their lumber on rail cars shipped out there, 2x4s, etc., and they could just get a bunch of guys with hammers and nails and go nuts and start throwing these buildings up. Well, some of the old guard, the apprentice timber framers, started seeing some of this stuff, and they would raise these walls, which were maybe 2 or 3 stories high, and these spindly 2x4s. And they say, that's so light and airy, it's just like a balloon. Looks like it'll float away. And that's how the balloon is. Is it better to have a tight barn or a barn that breathes? Well, this was debated, 1840s. It is a very great and beneficial improvement in building barns to have them shingled down the sides as well as the roof. The extra expense is not so much as many people are ready to imagine, as there are considerable savings to be made in the quality of boards and nails where shingle is practiced. Besides, it keeps the barn frame warm and the frame dry. Therefore, I think there is no loss and considerable gain in the end by shingling the sides. Okay, that's one argument. Well, they found out if you tighten up a barn, you better ventilate it. And that's when you started seeing these, 1850s. This is only 10 years later than the prior argument, 11 years later. The breath from cattle, together with the vapor rising from the manure, covers not only the floor over the cellar, but the beams and the whole underside of the roof with pearly trickling drops for weeks together during the winter. If the doors are thrown open in order to evaporate this moisture, you lose the benefits you've been seeking in making a tight barn by reducing the temperature so much that the cattle require more food, while the effect is to reduce the flow of milk in the cows. Many large and valuable barns have been very much damaged by being placed over a manure cellar without proper ventilation. And imagine back in the day, a building full of animals and manure basement. On a cold morning, this must have been just like a chimney with the vapor coming out of it. All right, well, we've heard of urban renewal, right? Well, there was a thing called rural renewal turn of the last century. There was never a time in our state when there was so much inquiry upon and interest in the proper arrangement and construction of barns as is now abroad among our farmers. It is realized that there is money in a good barn, and that no one who proposes to put business methods into his management can afford to neglect this important attachment to his farm. Hence, up and down the state, farmers are modifying and building over their ill-planned structures, or are tearing them down to make room for the new and the modern. After World War II, everybody started getting tractors. They didn't like their old barns because you couldn't drive your tractor in them. So they started either cutting things away or building lean-tos on the sides of them, or just tearing them down altogether. We lost a lot of old barns, and it's somebody like me who loves these English tying joints. They just didn't fit with the modern way. I think that's a common story with a lot of things. Well, that just about rounds me out. Be happy to take some questions.
I was going to ask you,
Yeah.
the prefab barns, they came out of the James Way systems or
Yep.
the Radford systems. Do you find many of those?
Sears.
Yeah, Sears, all
Sears
put
Roebuck.
together. Yeah,
Yep.
they can be
Montgomery
thrown up
Ward.
in a week.
Yep, I have come across some of those. Yeah, those are very popular. And they were argued as better buildings,
Yeah,
you know, because they were all machine cut instead of hand cut.
fit together.
Yep, I have come across some of those. There's one in next to Searsport that I've seen. And there were houses too, right?
Yeah,
Kit homes, yeah.
Quite a few of us noticed that's Jim Larry up there.
Yeah, Jim Leary. Yeah, Leary Farm and nearby Saco. He was a great interview.
Yeah.
He's in the book.
Talk to him.
Smiling Hill Farm, Roger Knight is in the book. He was a great interview. Yes,
What's a French barn, French style barn? Is that the same as English?
you know, you're asking something outside of my range of knowledge. I don't have a lot of experience with that. Yes,
I was curious too, in your research, if you, I have been sworn to secrecy on the location of these, but we know of a couple of locations of barns with internally constructed silos. And another thing too is if you came across any that had internally constructed cisterns in the Haymo area.
the silos, absolutely, very
Yeah.
common, very common. And those
So
are.
I understand a lot of them got ripped out over a period of time.
Now you think of a silo as being round and outside with the hoops. Well, the early silos were square. And I don't think I have a picture. on my presentation of that. But sometimes you'll see, maybe on the eave, in the middle of the length of the barn, along the eaves, you'll see this square thing poking up. The Leary's farm on Route 1 has that. And that's an interior, the early silos were square. They would take what we call bay in between two posts, and they would wall that in to make a silo. And plaster it, try to make it airtight so the feed would keep. And they would pack it down with rocks and stuff up top and with planks, and try to keep it airtight so it would keep the fodder in there. But they found that that wasn't a very strong system, and they had trouble with blowouts. And you think about a paper cup, there's a reason why they're round. They're just much stronger that way. If you have a square paper cup, it's just the pressure from your hand getting it would cause it to deform. So those early silos, they didn't have very good luck with, but they're very common. I have not seen the cisterns though. I don't have a lot of experience with those.
We're new to Scarborough, we were looking for a house, there's a barn, it was a Beech Ridge Road, with a house, an old barn, and it had up like third or fourth level, a great big barrel kind of structure.
Yeah.
Would that have been a cistern, or?
Was it like a horizontal or a vertical barrel?
Well, it wasn't the barrel shaped like this, it was more like,
I think I know what
like
you're.
that. I mean, it came, wasn't it narrower at the top?
Was it like a winch?
A
Or,
winch?
or a hoist?
It was just sitting up there on those rafters,
Huh.
and we just wondered what it was for.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, would they collect rain and water panels?
I don't think so.
I think so.
What I thought you were leading to was a slaughter hoist. I see a lot of those. Not a lot of those, but I do see those. They would, haul the animal up and.
Well, you'll have to go take a look
Bleed
at
it
that
out.
barn and see what you think it is.
It's great looking at old barns. They're always a detective story.
This was a great barn.
Yes.
Are there certain clues that you can use to determine the age of a barn?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You
Just-
mentioned one, the hand hewn,
Yep.
was done before the Civil War.
In this area of the state, yes. Are you talking about this area?
Well, I'm from I just moved from Massachusetts,
Mhm.
and I had a very old barn, and I was told it was black chestnut beams, hand hewn,
Mhm.
and I don't know how it was tied together. I assume it was the English time. And I tried to figure out through all the paperwork, and I got to the census of 1850 that there was a farmer living on that plot of land, so I assumed the barn was there at the same time.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering if there are clues.
Yeah, there are. What I found is you can just get a range. You can't get very specific.
Yeah.
But like I opened the talk with this barn that's got an offset door. I don't know if you've noticed if your aisle or doorway is centered or if it's offset. If it's offset, it's usually before the Civil War.
It's offset.
Okay. That's one clue, and then I think
What do they make the beams out of mostly?
they were mostly pine.
Okay, I
Or
was
oak.
chestnut,
Um,
yeah, for the blight.
Yep. But if you look around your structure, if you notice wherever there's like braces coming into posts, you see these Roman numerals chiseled in here? They call those carpenters or marriage marks. And those are when everything was made, this post wouldn't work on the other side of the building. Because you can't hand hew 30 posts exactly the same, and they're slightly out of square, and et cetera. So they had to literally scribe these joints together, and that, this brace had to go here. Except if you have marks like that, it's before the Civil War, in this part of the state. And if you have a roof with vertical boards as opposed to horizontal boards, it's usually before the Civil War.
You have to have a lot of respect for the builders of the day.
Yes,
You
absolutely.
do.
Oh, I'm amazed what they could do,
Yes.
and a lot of that has been lost. Yes,
we're from Harpswell, and we have a barn who was built at one size, and then you watch it expanded.
Yeah,
And the two things about it, they use those knee braces, like ship braces,
yeah.
to join the two together. And the amount of recycled beams from other buildings, the marks don't match up anywhere, but
Yeah.
good Yankee, they're not wasting anything, so it just,
That's a great point, that's
Put
very
back into
common to
something.
find.
Yeah.
They were recycling before, that was a buzzword,
yeah.
Or you'll see some half-charred, maybe burned things, where a building burned and they cobbled together what they could. Yeah, that's very common here in Maine, which was mostly poor farmers, just,
Good old Yankees.
but the ship's knees, I talked a lot about Harpswell, Allen Point Road,
Yeah.
in here. And that was a shipbuilding, right next to Bath, shipbuilding center of the world at one time. A lot of ship's knees in there, which are fascinating. And the ship's knee, instead of a brace here, you would have, it was part of where a root comes up into the tree, that kind of brace, they would use that right here. So you didn't have this sloping thing on a ship, cuts down, like a lot of ships were packed with lumber, and especially in this part of the state, were packed with lumber and sailed down the coast, etc. And they wanted to put as much lumber as they could in them, and if you had this brace, it wouldn't allow you to push the lumber right up against them. So they used that ship's knee. Anything else?
Good.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Anything else to book for a Christmas gift? I'll inscribe a book to you or whoever you'd like. Thank you.